A young woman who had just finished school and landed her first job traveled to another city for a work seminar. But she never made it there. The police got involved in the search, and soon they started uncovering one disturbing lead after another. They quickly realized that something truly horrifying might have happened to her. But solving the case turned out to be much more complicated than it seemed at first. It wasn't until nearly 3 decades later that they finally learned the truth. But the outcome was far from what they had expected. Barrett Lynn Beck was born on April 12, 1972, in the small town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. It was a quiet, peaceful place where, as the locals said, nothing much ever happened, neither good nor bad. Life there was slow-paced, crime rates were low, and the town was a popular choice for families with kids. Barrett lived in Sturtevant with her parents and her younger brother. She went to the local school, had plenty of friends, and was well-liked because of her warm personality. One of her biggest passions was music. She played the violin in her school orchestra. In high school, Barrett started dating a boy named Kurt, and their relationship continued after they both graduated. By the summer of 1990, Barrett was 18 and thinking about her future. She planned to go to college, but hadn't settled on a career just yet. She was exploring different options, but one thing was certain: they all had something to do with music. In the meantime, Barrett got herself a job to save up some money before college. She started working at the office of a pretty big company, and in July of that year, she was set to attend a 3-day seminar to learn how to work on computers. This was a big deal for Barrett. Just a few weeks out of high school, she now had to travel to another city called Appleton, hundreds of miles away from her home, all on her own. At first, Barrett's parents weren't too thrilled about the trip. They were naturally worried about their daughter traveling such a long distance alone and spending a few days in another city. But eventually they came around. They knew she was an adult now, and the seminar was an important part of her job. On the morning of July 17th, they gave her the family van, helped her pack for the trip, and saw her off as she hit the road. Barrett had promised to call her parents as soon as she checked into her hotel, but as the hours went by, there was still no word from her. Her parents, already nervous about the trip, grew even more worried, especially since the drive to the city should have only taken a couple of hours. By evening, they decided to call the hotel, only to find out that Barrett had never checked in. Desperate for answers, they started reaching out to her coworkers, friends, and anyone else who might have seen her that day. But no one had. Despite all this, her parents clung to hope. They thought maybe she changed her plans, checked into another hotel, or stayed with someone she knew. They decided to wait until morning, hoping for good news. But when the seminar started and Barrett didn't show up, they knew something was wrong, and decided it was time to call the police. The police department got involved, but initially they didn't do much. They just put out a notice with a description of her van. Barrett was an adult and there wasn't any clear evidence of foul playing, so they decided to hold off on launching a full-scale search and just wait. The day went by with no word from Barrett. She didn't contact her parents or show up at the seminar. The police also weren't able to locate her van, leaving everyone in limbo. The next day brought no developments either, until July 19th. That's when the police received a tip about a van matching the description parked near a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, about 65 miles from Barrett's home. Officers quickly confirmed that it was indeed her family's van and began examining it for clues. The van's doors were locked and there was no sign of Barrett inside or anywhere near. The first thing officers found was a receipt from a Walgreens located just across the street from the parking lot. The timestamp showed it was issued on July 17th, the day she disappeared. When police spoke with the employee, they confirmed that Barrett had stopped by around noon. She was alone, seemed in good spirits, and her behavior raised no concerns. However, some other findings in the van painted a more troubling picture. The radar detector and stereo were missing, suggesting a possible robbery. But this was just the beginning. The van's interior was littered with cigarette ash, a lot of it. Given that Barrett had never smoked, it was clear someone else had been in the van. And judging by the amount of ash, they'd spent a considerable amount of time there. Then there were her belongings. Almost everything Barrett had taken with her was still in the van. Her red shirt, The one she was wearing when she left home was on the floor, but part of it had been torn. The dress she'd planned to wear to the seminar was also there, along with her stockings, which had been tied into a knot. Even the shoes she'd worn when she left were still inside. One more detail stood out to investigators. Before Barrett's parents handed over the van, they recorded the mileage because her company had promised to cover her travel expenses. But when the police checked the odometer, they noticed an extra 461 miles. Considering it was only about 65 miles from her home to the parking lot, someone had driven the van much farther before leaving it there. Another clue pointing to someone else's presence in the van was the discovery of a couple of disposable coffee cups, one from McDonald's and the other from Burger King. Considering Barrett had likely driven only about 65 miles before something happened to her, detectives doubted she would have stopped at two different places for coffee. These details led investigators to suspect that Barrett might have been abducted or that someone had stolen her van. However, the second theory seemed unlikely. She had been out of contact for several days and there was still no trace of her whereabouts. The police tried to piece together a timeline of Barrett's last known movements and reconstruct her route. They discovered that she didn't head out immediately after leaving home. Her first stop was to visit her boyfriend, Kurt. He told investigators that they talked for a while, discussed her upcoming trip and seminar, and then she left. Kurt said he hadn't heard from her since, and police found no evidence to suggest he was somehow involved in her disappearance. However, detectives did find something interesting. Kurt had given Barrett a fairly expensive ring, which she reportedly never took off. Yet, during the inspection of the van, the ring was found under one of the floor mats. Its placement suggested it had been intentionally hidden there because it seemed unlikely that it could have simply fallen off of her finger and ended up under the mat by accident. If the ring had been removed by an unknown perpetrator, it raised another question. Why would someone steal the radar detector and stereo but leave behind a valuable piece of jewelry? Meanwhile, forensic experts completed a thorough examination of Barrett's van and found dozens of fingerprints inside. Police asked her friends and family members to provide their prints so they could rule them out, leaving behind a few unidentified prints. These included fingerprints on a coffee cup, the inside of one of the windows, and on the boxes of cosmetics Barrett had purchased at Walgreens. But without a suspect to compare them to, these prints didn't help move the case forward. While the police continued to look for new leads, Barrett's family organized an extensive search effort. They brought in over 100 volunteers, gave interviews to local news stations, and combed through hundreds of miles along the route Barrett was supposed to take. On top of that, they raised $75,000 as a reward for any information about her whereabouts. Over the following weeks, detectives received several tips, but none of them led to a breakthrough in the case. This went on for over a month until August 22nd, when the police received a call. A local farmer was driving down a rural road about 18 miles from where Barrett's van had been found. He noticed something unusual in a ditch along the side of the road and decided to take a closer look. To his horror, he realized it was a human body and reported it to the authorities. Officers arrived on the scene and confirmed that the remains belonged to a woman. However, due to the advanced state of decomposition, it was impossible to visually identify her. Still, detectives suspected it could be Barrett, and a comparison with her dental records soon confirmed their worst fears. Because of the condition of the body, medical examiners couldn't determine a specific cause of death. They suggested that the victim might have been strangled, but one thing was certain: this was a murder. Beyond the obvious evidence pointing to foul play, there was one particularly chilling detail. A piece of fabric from Barrett's shirt was tied around her head, covering her eyes like a blindfold. This suggested she had been kidnapped and likely held alive for some time. Although this probably didn't last long, according to the medical examiner's report, the body had been lying in the ditch for over a month. This led investigators to believe that the killer murdered her on the same day she was abducted. Unfortunately, the discovery of Barrett's body didn't bring investigators any closer to solving the case. Months passed without any major breakthroughs. Detectives interviewed multiple suspects, searched for new evidence, and followed every lead, but each one led to a dead end. Investigators assumed Barrett may have been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. They believed that when she parked near the Walgreens and went inside, someone broke into her van. The intruder might have planned to steal valuables and leave. But when Barrett came back and caught them in the act, things took a darker turn. Fearing being caught, the person may have decided to abduct her, later killing her and dumping her body in a roadside ditch. Adding to this theory was the van's odometer. After Barrett vanished, the van had been driven for nearly 500 miles, much more than the distance from her home to where it was abandoned. This suggests that her killer spent a lot of time driving the van before ultimately leaving it behind. Since robbery was considered the prime motive, police began focusing on individuals known for similar crimes. Before long, they zeroed in on a man named Craig, who was suspected of stealing several vehicles not far from the area where Barrett was last seen. What caught investigators' attention was Craig's pattern. He often used stolen cars to commit other crimes and drove them for some time before abandoning them, behavior that aligned with the movements of Barrett's killer. Detectives started digging into Craig's possible involvement and discovered something interesting. Shortly after Barrett's disappearance, he had been arrested for an armed bank robbery. During his arrest, authorities found a bag in his possession. Among its contents was a woman's hairbrush with blonde hair tangled in it. Unfortunately, in those days, DNA testing wasn't as advanced as it is now. Without the ability to compare the hair to Barrett's DNA, police couldn't definitively link the brush to the victim. Investigators also learned that Craig theoretically had the opportunity to commit the crime, but this fact alone wasn't enough to prove his guilt. However, soon after, detectives received a lead that completely shifted the direction of the case. During interviews with Craig's acquaintances, one of his friends suddenly revealed that Craig had confessed to killing Barrett. Not only that, but he allegedly showed him her body inside the van before disposing of it. The revelation made detectives take Craig even more seriously as their prime suspect. But there was one major issue. His fingerprints didn't match any of those found in Barrett's van. Craig also denied any involvement, leaving investigators scrambling for a way to prove his connection to the crime. Over the following months, they searched for new evidence, but nothing concrete came to light. At one point, police considered formally charging Craig with Barrett's murder, hoping that the testimony from his friend would be enough to secure a conviction. However, they ultimately decided that without strong evidence, the prosecution wouldn't stand a chance in court. Despite this, Craig remained the prime suspect, and for years after, detectives continued their efforts to uncover any new leads to prove his involvement. Unfortunately, this went on for decades without any serious progress. But everything changed when in 2013, this case was handed over to a cold case unit for a fresh review. As detectives began going through the old files and evidence, they encountered a frustrating setback. Some of Barrett's clothing, which was supposed to be stored as evidence, was missing, even though it was listed in the official records. The team couldn't track it down, and it appeared that someone, likely an officer, had mistakenly discarded those items. Despite this, investigators sent the remaining evidence to the lab for analysis and requested a new comparison of the fingerprints on file. To their shock, they discovered that in the 23 years since the murder, the fingerprints had never been digitized and were still only stored on paper. Shortly after the prints were uploaded into the database, the lead detective received a call from the lab. The analyst had found a match. 5 of the fingerprints from the van belonged to a man named Dennis Brantner. This name had never come up in the case files before. Police quickly learned he had an extensive criminal record, which is how his fingerprints ended up in the database. In his younger years, Dennis served time for stealing cars and was later arrested for breaking into someone's home. In another disturbing incident, he snuck into a hotel room where a woman was staying, stole her underwear, and left some notes with inappropriate content behind. But one particular episode caught the detective's attention because of its eerie parallels to Barrett's case. Dennis once broke into his ex-wife's car while she was at work and waited for her return. When she got in, he pulled a knife and tried to kidnap her. Fortunately, she managed to escape and reported him to the police. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that at the time of Barrett's murder, Dennis was working as a long-haul truck driver in the same area. His job regularly took him through countless towns and cities, giving him plenty of opportunities to commit such a crime. Still, police wanted to be cautious before jumping to conclusions. First, they confirmed that Dennis didn't know Barrett or anyone in her family, which might have explained the presence of his fingerprints in their van. But there was one key detail they couldn't ignore. One of Dennis' fingerprints was found on a box of cosmetics Barrett had purchased just minutes before she vanished. This meant he had been in the van at that exact time, significantly increasing suspicions against him. The investigators decided to confront Dennis and visit his home. Dennis began denying any involvement in Barrett's murder and insisted he had never met her. However, when the detectives mentioned that his fingerprints had been found in her van, his demeanor changed drastically. Dennis became visibly nervous, occasionally breaking into tears as he answered their questions. But despite this, he continued to maintain his innocence, prompting the detectives to dig deeper for more evidence. When they interviewed people who knew Dennis, they uncovered several intriguing details. His ex-wife mentioned that Dennis always preferred Burger King, which he frequented regularly. In contrast, Barrett preferred McDonald's. And as we remember, investigators had found coffee cups from both fast food chains in Barrett's van, and Dennis' fingerprint was on the Burger King cup. Next, the detective spoke to Dennis' former co-workers, which led to an even more startling discovery. After Barrett's murder, Dennis had briefly worked at a factory. 3 of his colleagues recalled that he kept a photo of a young blonde woman in his toolbox during that time. Unfortunately, after so many years, it was impossible to determine whether the woman in the photo was Barrett, but the co-workers noted a strong resemblance. Another former co-worker shared a chilling story. Dennis had once told her that he wanted to kidnap and assault her. While the police continued gathering evidence, they received crucial updates from the lab. Despite the earlier loss of some of Barrett's belongings, several items from her van remained in storage, including a cigarette pack wrapper. Using modern forensic tools, investigators found a new fingerprint on it, one that also belonged to Dennis. The collection of all this evidence and information took nearly a year, and in March 2015, Dennis was finally arrested and charged with Barrett's murder. But there was a significant challenge. While Dennis' fingerprints were found in the victim's vehicle, the prosecution feared this might not be enough for a conviction. By 2015, public perception had shifted to view DNA evidence as the gold standard in criminal cases. Unlike DNA, fingerprints did not establish a direct link to the murder itself. For instance, it was possible Dennis had been in the van under some other circumstances, leaving room for doubt about his involvement in the murder. Despite extensive forensic efforts, they couldn't find DNA samples linking Dennis to Barrett, her belongings, or her vehicle. Still, the case was brought to trial, which began in the summer of 2016. During the trial, Dennis' defense lawyer capitalized on the lack of conclusive evidence, arguing that fingerprints alone did not definitively prove his guilt. Eventually, this argument raised enough doubt among the jurors that they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and the process ended in a mistrial. Despite this setback, the prosecution quickly announced their intention to prepare for a retrial. For Barrett's family, the situation was agonizing. For 26 years, they had no idea what had happened to her, and now they had to watch as the man police firmly believes was responsible for her murder escape punishment. The second trial was scheduled for early 2018, but it came with its own set of challenges. The prosecution argued that Dennis attacked Barrett with the intent to assault her before murdering her, but proving his intentions beyond a reasonable doubt was even more difficult. The severity of his potential sentence depended directly on this argument, leaving the prosecution in a precarious position. If they failed to convince the jury of his guilt, Dennis could not be tried for the crime again and might walk free. After lengthy deliberations and consultations with Barrett's family, the prosecution reached a painful compromise. They decided to offer Dennis a plea deal. He would plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter. This ensured that he would go to prison, though for a significantly shorter time, and the case would finally be considered solved after 28 long years. After consulting with his lawyer, Dennis accepted this deal and he was sentenced to the maximum possible term, 10 years in prison. With the time he had already spent in jail since his arrest, his total prison sentence was basically just 7 years. It meant that Dennis would be released at the age of 71. Barrett's parents, understandably, were upset by the lenient sentence, but they understood that without accepting the deal, there was a very strong possibility that Dennis would escape punishment entirely. For this reason, they reluctantly supported the plea agreement, fearing they might lose the only chance to achieve at least some justice. In memory of their daughter, her parents established a scholarship at her high school, awarded for excellence in music, which exists to this day. It is also worth noting that, decades later, police managed to disprove the testimony against Craig, the first suspect in the case. As we recall, one of his acquaintances claimed that Craig had shown him Barrett's body in her van, but this turned out to be a lie. It turns out this person had a personal issue with Craig and had used information he overheard from the police to frame him. Shannon Christian was born on April 29, 1985 in Texas. When she was 12, her family moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, where she settled in with her parents and older brother. Shannon was the kind of person who made friends instantly. Outgoing, friendly, always ready to help. She fit right into her new school like she'd always been there. People who knew her said she could connect with just about anyone. That warmth and kindness played a big part in her future plans. Shannon wanted to do something meaningful, something that would help others. So, after high school, she enrolled at the University of Tennessee to study sociology. Another reason she chose that school was because she wanted to stay close to home. Shannon was incredibly close to her family, and staying nearby just felt right. But she was also determined to be independent, so she picked up 2 part-time jobs to support herself. While she was at college, she met a guy named Chris Newsom. They hit it off and started dating. At the time, Shannon was 21, and Chris was 23. He worked as a carpenter, and even though he was still young, he had already built a solid reputation for himself around town. On January 6, 2007, Shannon and Chris were planning to go to a friend's birthday party. That afternoon, Shannon went over to her friend's house, where Chris was supposed to pick her up a bit later. He was running a little behind, so Shannon's friend ended up heading to the party without her, and Shannon decided to stay at the house and wait for Chris to show up. Before picking up Shannon, Chris had dropped off another friend at the same party and headed straight to get his girlfriend. But about an hour later, people at the party started to worry. Shannon was only about a 10-minute drive away, but neither she nor Chris had arrived. It just didn't make sense. At first, their friends figured maybe their plans had changed, but something about that didn't sit right. It wasn't like them to just skip out on a close friend's birthday without saying anything. After waiting a while longer, they tried calling both of them, but neither one answered. By the time midnight rolled around, their concern had reached its peak. So, a few of them decided to drive over to the apartment complex where Shannon had been waiting. When they got to the parking lot, they saw Chris' truck, but Shannon's car, the one she had driven earlier, was nowhere to be found. So, their friends assumed the couple had just decided to skip the party without telling anyone and headed back to celebrate. A bit earlier, Shannon had called her mom and said she'd be home later than expected. She and Chris had decided to spend the evening together, maybe grab something to eat and watch a movie. She told her mom she'd be back around 3:30 in the morning. But that time came and went, and Shannon never showed up. At first, her mom figured she might have stayed the night at a friend's or maybe at Chris' place, so she didn't panic right away. But the next morning, she got a call that changed everything. Shannon's boss said she hadn't shown up for work. Shannon's mom got in touch with Chris's parents and found out that he hadn't come home the night before either. Neither of them were answering their phones, and now both families were seriously worried. Their friends couldn't reach them either. The whole thing felt off. Sure, Shannon and Chris were adults, but they always kept in touch with their parents. They had never just disappeared overnight without saying anything, and Shannon took her job seriously. There was no way she'd miss a shift without a good reason. Their family started calling every hospital in the area, but no one matching their descriptions had been admitted anywhere. So, they turned to the police for help, but the local department refused to open a case, saying that since both Shannon and Chris were adults, the families would have to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. But Shannon's family wasn't just going to sit around and wait. Her parents reached out to her phone company, hoping that they could help, and surprisingly, they agreed to trace her phone. They said that during the night, Shannon had checked her voicemail 3 times, and that was the last time her phone showed any activity before it turned off. The last signal had pinged off a cell tower near North Cherry Street that only made her parents more anxious. Knoxville was generally a safe city, but that particular area was known for high crime. It didn't make any sense. Why would Shannon be there? Determined to find answers, her family started searching the neighborhood themselves. After hours of driving around, they finally spotted her car. It was parked just a couple of blocks away from where her phone had last pinged. As soon as Shannon's family got to the car, they knew something was wrong. All of her belongings were missing. Photos, her phone charger, everything she normally kept with her. The interior of the car was dirty, which was totally unlike her. Shannon always kept her car spotless. Even more unsettling, the driver's seat had been pushed all the way back, suggesting someone much taller had been behind the wheel. Clearly, Shannon hadn't been the one driving. After this unsettling discovery, her parents called the police again, and this time officers finally took action. When they arrived at the scene, they noticed something deeply disturbing. The car's interior and door handles had been wiped down, like someone was trying to erase fingerprints. And there was one more thing that didn't sit right: a crumpled, empty pack of cigarettes inside the car. The problem was, neither Shannon nor Chris smoked. All signs pointed to the car possibly being stolen, but investigators still had no clue where Shannon or Chris were. Then, while searching the car, they finally found something that gave them a real lead. An envelope wedged between the seats. It had the address of a house, located right there in the same neighborhood. Even more telling, forensics found a fingerprint on the envelope, and it didn't take long to get a match. The print belonged to a man named LaMarcus Davidson, a convicted felon with a long rap sheet. And as it turned out, he lived at the very address written on the envelope. Detectives headed straight to the house, but no one was there. Still, they had reason to believe Shannon and Chris might be in immediate danger, and that gave them legal grounds to enter without a warrant. The inside of the house was a mess, but police immediately spotted Shannon's purse, her shoes, and a few other personal items. They also found Chris's baseball cap and his driver's license. But the most horrifying discovery was waiting for them in the kitchen. When one of the officers lifted the lid of the trash can, he found something wrapped in a piece of cloth. Underneath it was a human body. It was Shannon. The case was immediately reclassified as a homicide investigation. Her body was sent to the medical examiner, and detectives were now focused on 2 urgent questions. Where was Chris? And where was LaMarcus Davidson? And they didn't have to wait long for one of those answers. Right after Shannon's body was found, police got word from another department. Nearly 2 days earlier, a railroad employee had discovered the body of an unidentified man near the train tracks. At the time, no one had been able to identify him, but now detectives suspected it might be Chris. And soon, a DNA test confirmed their worst fears. The examination of Shannon and Chris' bodies revealed a truly horrifying picture. They both had numerous injuries, cuts, bruises, and signs of abuse. It was also clear that they both had been sexually assaulted. Chris died from multiple gunshot wounds, while Shannon's cause of death was determined to be suffocation. Forensic experts found biological evidence on Shannon's body that matched LaMarcus Davidson. His fingerprints were also discovered on the trash bags used to wrap her remains. And if that wasn't enough, investigators also found spent shell casings inside Davidson's house. Those casings matched the bullets that were recovered from Chris' body. With all of this evidence, police had no doubt that LaMarcus was directly involved in the murders, so they focused all their efforts on finding him. Detectives pulled his cell phone records and discovered that over the past couple of days, LaMarcus had been in frequent contact with a man named Eric. It didn't take long for police to track Eric down. At first, he claimed he didn't know where LaMarcus was. But as soon as investigators explained what LaMarcus was suspected of, and that Eric himself could be charged as an accomplice, he quickly changed his mind and gave up the address. According to Eric, LaMarcus had been hiding out in an empty house that was up for sale. He also admitted that on the very same day Shannon and Chris disappeared, they both had robbed it. Police headed to the house, and sure enough, they found LaMarcus there. He was surrounded by trash and empty food containers, and he had a gun with him. But one detail stood out even more. He was wearing Chris's sneakers. Officers took him in for questioning, and from the very beginning, he denied any involvement. Then he started changing his story again and again. In total, LaMarcus gave investigators 5 completely different versions of what happened, each one contradicting the last. At first, he claimed he had no idea what anyone was talking about. Then, he said Shannon and Chris had been kidnapped by someone else, and he had nothing to do with it. Later, he told detectives he'd just used the victim's car to drive around and sell drugs. In the end, LaMarcus never confessed, but he did give police a few useful pieces of information. Based on what he said, it was becoming clear that more than one person might have been involved in the murders, and detectives agreed that theory made the most sense. According to LaMarcus, the Real killers were his half-brother, Latalvis, and their mutual friend, George. Detectives quickly tracked both men down and brought them in for questioning, along with Eric, who was now also being treated as an accomplice. None of them were in a hurry to confess, but during the interrogations, police uncovered something interesting. They concluded that all 4 men had likely played some role in the crime, and they weren't alone. There was a 5th person involved, an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa. Detectives located her and took her into custody as well. With all 5 suspects now under arrest, the questioning continued. Eventually, they all started turning on each other, pointing fingers and telling stories that shifted the blame away from themselves. But even with their conflicting accounts, the growing pile of evidence helped detectives piece together a picture of what really happened that night. Based on everything investigators gathered, LaMarcus seemed to be the ringleader of the group. He was mainly involved in selling drugs, and that night he planned to steal a car to use for deliveries. He brought along 3 accomplices plus Vanessa, and they went out looking for the right vehicle. As they were driving through a residential complex, the same one where Shannon was waiting, they spotted her car. She was sitting inside, and Chris was standing next to it. That's when they decided not just to steal the vehicle, but to abduct the couple as well. They forced Shannon and Chris into the car at gunpoint and drove them to LaMarcus' house. According to DNA evidence, both LaMarcus and Latalvis secretly assaulted the victims, and the abuse went on for hours. On top of that, they subjected the couple to other forms of torture and humiliation. By early morning, the attackers led Chris out of the house and took him to the railroad tracks, where they shot him multiple times and left his body there. Then, they returned to the house and continued tormenting Shannon. She remained alive for nearly 2 full days. During that time, her friends and family had already started searching for her, though her car hadn't been found yet. Eventually, they killed her too. Her body was stuffed into a trash can and left inside the house. Investigators also learned that LaMarcus didn't just steal Chris's sneakers. He also took his phone and some of Shannon's personal items, which he later gave to his girlfriend as gifts. As for Vanessa, she insisted that she was a victim too, that she had been at the house against her will. But police found a diary in her home that completely contradicted her story. In it, Vanessa described the day as a wild adventure and wrote that she genuinely enjoyed the experience. In the end, all of the suspects were hit with long lists of charges, and the prosecution began preparing for trial. It took more than 2 years to get everything ready, and during that time, the defense attorneys managed to have the trial moved to a different county. The reason was simple. The case had caused a massive public outcry in Knoxville. People were horrified by what had been done to this young couple, and the defense argued there was no way their clients could get a fair trial in that city. Eventually, the court agreed, and the venue was changed. The first to go on trial was Eric. Throughout the investigation, police were never able to find solid proof that he had directly taken part in the murders, but they did uncover enough evidence to show that he knew what was going on. In the end, he received the maximum sentence for the charges against him, 18 years in prison. Next came the trials of LaMarcus, Latalvis, and George. In a desperate attempt to defend them, their attorney claimed that Shannon and Chris had willingly participated in the horrific abuse they were subjected to. The jury, of course, didn't buy that ridiculous story for a second, and all three men were found guilty. Lamarcus was sentenced to death, while Atalvis and George received life in prison. Vanessa's case was a bit more complicated. At first, she had been granted immunity in exchange for testifying against the others, but the court later ruled that her immunity only applied to the carjacking charges, not to the charges related to the murder and sexual assault. So, Vanessa did end up facing trial, and eventually she was convicted and sentenced to 53 years in prison. In the end, all those responsible were brought to justice. But not long after the verdicts were handed down, the case took a surprising turn. In 2011, the judge who had presided over all 5 trials resigned amidst a scandal. It came to light that he had been having an affair with a court employee, and had also been buying illegal drugs from criminals. Because of this, a higher court decided to review several of the sentences he had issued, including those of Lamarcus, Vanessa, George, and Latalvis. The news sparked outrage, and understandably so. In the end, prosecutors were able to successfully challenge the decisions involving Lamarcus and Latalvis, meaning their original sentences stood. But the other two, Vanessa and George, were granted new trials. Vanessa was once again found guilty of the same charges, but this time she received a reduced sentence of 35 years instead of 53. George also got a lighter sentence, which made him eligible for parole after serving 51 years. Still, the retrials of Vanessa and George ended up having consequences in the other direction too. During those new proceedings, the prosecution gathered a significant amount of new evidence that suggested Eric had, in fact, taken an active part in the abuse and murders. In 2019, he was hit with new charges. This time, he was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 90 years. Considering that his original sentence was just 18 years, this new ruling all but erased any chance he had of ever being released. Vanessa, on the other hand, became eligible for parole after serving just 7 years. But so far, all of her requests have been denied, and she remains behind bars. In the end, despite all the setbacks, those responsible for the murders of Shannon and Chris were held accountable and received serious prison time, though many still believe every one of them deserved the death penalty. This crime didn't just shake Knoxville. It sent shockwaves across the entire country. People struggled to comprehend how anyone could be capable of something so cruel and inhuman. The house where it all happened was eventually bought by a local company. It was torn down, and in its place, a memorial was built to honor Shannon and Chris. The University of Tennessee also established scholarships in their names, ones that are still active today. And finally, it's worth noting that Lamarcus' death sentence has yet to be carried out. Nearly 20 years after the murders, he's still sitting on death row. Lisa Mitchell was born on August 5, 1983, in Calgary, Canada. From an early age, she had a real love for anything creative. When she was just 4, she got into drawing, and that passion stuck with her as she got older. In high school, she also discovered a love for music and even started a band with a few of her friends. After graduation, Lisa decided to hold off on college. She needed to work and support herself, so she bounced between a few part-time jobs. While working at a restaurant, she met a man named Alan. The two started dating, and a few years later, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. Eventually, they moved into their own home in a quiet neighborhood and focused on raising their family. This went on until October 2012. On the 27th, Lisa, who was 29 at the time, headed to her evening shift at a hotel where she worked alongside her mom. That night, the hotel was hosting a Halloween-themed party, and Lisa and her mom had a great time working the event together. After her shift, Lisa decided to spend the night at her mom's place, since the drive back to her own house was pretty long. The next morning, they chatted about the party and talked over their plans for the week, when suddenly, Lisa's phone rang. After a quick call, she told her mom she had to head home right away. She said goodbye, got in her car, and left. Her mom thought it was a little odd, but didn't dwell on it at the time. However, over the next few days, that feeling of unease started to grow, because Lisa never called her back. and that just wasn't like her. Lisa usually checked in with her mom a few times a week, no matter what. Her mom tried calling, but Lisa didn't pick up. At first, she figured Lisa was probably just busy. But as the days passed and there was still no word, she started to feel like something wasn't right. Eventually, she decided to drive over to Lisa's house to make sure everything was okay, but Lisa wasn't there. Instead, she was met by Alan, who told her he had no idea where Lisa was either. According to him, the day after she left her mom's, October 28th, they had gotten into an argument. He said he went out to buy cigarettes, and when he came back, Lisa was gone. But something about that story didn't sit right with Lisa's mom. She couldn't imagine her daughter just leaving without saying a word, and especially abandoning her kids. Then she noticed something strange. While talking to Alan in the hallway, she saw Lisa's winter coat and boots still in the closet. And since it was cold outside, there was no way Lisa would have gone anywhere without them. That's when she decided to look around the rest of the house. Inside, she found Lisa's favorite bracelet and necklace, the one she always wore whenever she left home. Her purse, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. Before she left, Alan mentioned one more thing. He said Lisa had sent him an email and suggested her mom check her inbox too. When she got home, she turned on the computer, and sure enough, there was a message from Lisa. In it, Lisa said she was just feeling tired and needed to get away for a while. As strange as it all seemed, the messages that followed kept reassuring her that everything was okay. They kept exchanging emails over the next few weeks, but no matter how many times her mom asked, Lisa never explained why she suddenly left or where she was. On November 16th, Lisa's mom woke up to find a missed call from her daughter. It had come in at 2:45 in the morning and went to voicemail. At first, she felt a wave of relief just hearing Lisa's voice, but as she listened to the actual message, that relief quickly turned into concern. Something about it felt off, and the more she replayed it, the less sense it seemed to make. Lisa said, "Hey, I'm okay. Sometimes my weeks get crazy, and it was quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden this happened, and within half a day I should. But he's back now, and I gotta go. Love you." None of it made any sense. Who was she talking about? What had happened? The message only raised more questions. That's when Lisa's mom realized she couldn't just wait around any longer. She decided it was time to go to the police. She told them everything that had been going on, and investigators started a search for Lisa. After speaking with her mom, they learned that Lisa and Alan's relationship had been rocky from the beginning. Even before their kids were born, the couple broke up and got back together more times than anyone could count. Things settled down a bit after they had children, but eventually, new problems started to surface. Lisa was frustrated that Alan had never managed to hold down a steady job. He bounced from one gig to another and sometimes didn't work at all. That left Lisa to support the family on her own, juggling 2 full-time jobs while also raising the kids. It all started to wear on her, and Lisa had begun thinking about ending the relationship. But in the end, she stayed for the sake of the children. When detectives brought Alan in for questioning, he admitted their relationship had been troubled. He said that in recent years, he and Lisa had agreed to stay together only for the sake of their kids. According to him, Lisa had been seeing other men from time to time, and he claimed he was fully aware of it. As for her disappearance, Alan said he had no idea where she might have gone. He added that he wasn't all that surprised she decided to leave. But what he couldn't understand was how she could just walk away and leave him alone with 2 kids. Police searched the house, but didn't find anything that pointed to what might have happened. Then, they checked Lisa's computer and found conversations with several men, which raised some eyebrows since those men lived in other cities. Investigators started to wonder if maybe Lisa had gone to stay with one of them. But when they contacted them, each of the men said the same thing. They hadn't seen Lisa. Police also tried to trace the email address that had been sending messages to Lisa's mom, as well as the phone number that left the voicemail, but neither led anywhere. Over the following months, investigators kept searching for new leads and pushed Lisa's story out to the media, but there was still no sign of her. Lisa's mom eventually stopped receiving emails, and with each passing month, her hope of ever seeing her daughter again began to fade. Deep down, she suspected Alan might have had something to do with Lisa's disappearance, but every time she brought it up, police told her the same thing. There was no evidence linking him to the case. As for Alan, he continued raising the kids on his own and eventually landed a steady job with decent pay. He met a man who was opening a new car dealership, and the guy offered him a full-time position. Later on, that man's girlfriend started babysitting Alan's kids from time to time, which made things a little easier for him. Eventually, Alan started thinking about dating again, and not long after, he actually got the chance. One day, as he was leaving work, a woman accidentally rear-ended his car. She'd lost control due to the weather and told him her company would cover the repairs. As a friendly gesture, she also gave him a pair of hockey tickets. They stayed in touch after that, and Alan started thinking about the possibility of building something more with her. This went on for about 2 years. It seemed like Alan was moving on with his life, and there were still no updates, no signs, and no messages from Lisa. In early December 2014, 2 years after Lisa's disappearance, Alan went on a work trip to another city with 2 of his coworkers. While he was there, he got a call from the police. A detective introduced himself and said he'd just been assigned to Lisa's case. He told Alan he believed Lisa was no longer alive and that they had a warrant to search his house again. In fact, they were already on their way. At that moment, Alan was sitting with his coworkers, and according to them, his face went completely pale during the call. After hanging up, he asked for a cigarette and said he needed to talk to them. Alan said that 2 years earlier, he and Lisa had gotten into yet another argument. He couldn't even remember what started it, only that it escalated quickly. According to him, Lisa grabbed a kitchen knife and started threatening him. She allegedly said she could send him to the hospital, then call the cops and claimed he attacked her first, and he'd end up in prison. Alan claimed that what happened next was a blur. Somehow, he managed to grab the knife from her, then pushed her to the floor and started choking her. When he realized she was dead, panic set in. He didn't know what to do, but in the end, he decided to bury her body underneath the house and make it look like she had simply left. After finishing his story, Alan turned to one of his coworkers for advice. He knew this man had gone through something somewhat similar in the past. The coworker had told Alan that he once crashed his car while driving drunk, and his friend who was in the car with him died. To avoid taking the blame, he had moved his friend's body into the driver's seat. So now Alan was looking to him for guidance. He started thinking through his options. He considered running away or trying to quickly hire a good lawyer who might be able to challenge the search warrant. At one point, he even floated the idea of going back to Calgary and burning the house down. But then he corrected himself, saying that a simple fire wouldn't be enough to destroy the evidence. He'd have to blow the whole place up. In the end, he realized he probably didn't have enough time to pull off any of those plans and decided that running was his best shot. His coworkers supported this idea and Alan started thinking about where he could go. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for. He wouldn't get the chance to carry out any of his plans. You see, that phone call from the detective wasn't just a heads up about a search warrant. In reality, it was the final step in a long, carefully planned police operation that had been in the works for over a year, all aimed at getting Alan to confess. Back in 2013, the province of Alberta had updated its laws regarding missing persons, giving law enforcement more tools to conduct investigations. Around that time, Lisa's case was handed off to a different department, and they immediately put those new tools to use. One of their first moves was digging deeper into the phone activity tied to the voicemail Lisa had left her mom. What they discovered was that the call came from a cheap, prepaid phone that had only been active for about a month after Lisa disappeared. During that time, it was used to make just 5 calls, 1 to Lisa's mom and 4 to Alan. The problem was, Alan had never once mentioned those calls to the police. What made things even more suspicious was the location of the phone activity. According to data from the cell provider, all 5 calls were made using a cell tower located near Lisa and Alan's home. And considering Lisa was supposedly long gone by then, that detail raised some serious red flags. That's when investigators started digging deeper into Alan's background. They pulled his financial records, and what they found was pretty disturbing. On the day Lisa disappeared, Alan had made a series of highly suspicious purchases. A large plastic tub, bleach, rubber gloves, cement, a big bucket, wooden boards, and cat litter. The last item stood out the most. Alan was severely allergic to cats, so there was no reason for him to be buying litter. Altogether, the purchases painted a grim picture. It looked like Alan had been preparing to get rid of a body. As for the phone Lisa supposedly used, detectives uncovered another clue: a purchase made with Alan's bank card at Walmart. The store had been selling the exact same model of prepaid phone used to make those 5 mysterious calls. But even with all of this, investigators still didn't have enough solid evidence to arrest Alan. They needed one of two things: either Lisa's body or a confession. So they came up with a bold plan: an undercover operation designed to infiltrate Alan's life. It was given the codename Aurora. The first step was to send in an undercover female officer. She accidentally bumped into Alan's car, which led to a casual conversation and, over time, a friendly connection. A little while later, she introduced him to another undercover officer, a man posing as someone about to open a new car dealership. He offered Alan a job, and the two quickly became friends. To keep up the illusion, police even made sure the dealership was set up and operating, so Alan would have no reason to suspect anything. Police brought in several more undercover officers to join the operation, placing them at the same dealership to build trust with Alan. Over time, they all became part of his daily life. Even the woman who often babysat his kids, the girlfriend of his supposed co-worker, turned out to be an undercover cop. As the months passed, Alan began to trust them. That's when detectives decided it was time to move into the final phase of the operation. They set up a fake work trip involving Alan and 2 of the undercover officers who had been posing as his colleagues. During that trip, the lead detective planned to call Alan and tell him they were about to search his house and that they believed Lisa's body was hidden there. The goal was simple: catch Alan off guard, make him panic, and hopefully get him to confess to the people he now saw as friends. And the plan worked almost perfectly. Both undercover officers who were traveling with Alan were wearing hidden recording devices, and they captured his full confession on tape. Shortly after Alan confessed to the undercover officers, he was arrested and brought back to Calgary. Meanwhile, investigators headed to his house to carry out the search. It's worth noting that police had actually searched the property 2 years earlier, including the basement, but nothing had seemed out of place at the time. This time, however, detectives had a clearer idea of what Alan might have done with Lisa's body, thanks to the list of suspicious purchases. So they combed through the basement much more carefully. In one corner, they spotted a strange cemented-over platform. It looked out of place, and its height matched exactly the wooden board Alan had bought 2 years earlier. Officers began taking the structure apart, and it didn't take long before they uncovered a hidden space underneath. Inside was a large plastic tub filled with salt and cat litter, and sure enough, inside that tub was the body of Lisa Mitchell. Even though Lisa's body had been hidden for 2 full years, Alan's attempt to preserve and conceal it ended up working against him. The way he stored the remains actually helped preserve them well enough for the medical examiner to determine a cause of death. Just as Alan had said in his confession, it was strangulation. And while police now had everything they needed to formally charge him, they also uncovered something else. When they went through Alan's computer, they found a series of internet searches made shortly after Lisa's death. He had been looking up how different materials and conditions affect the rate of decomposition. As for the emails Lisa supposedly sent to her mom during the first month she was missing, those were also traced back to Alan's computer. Even more disturbing, detectives discovered that Alan had secretly installed spyware on Lisa's phone. It let him not only listen in on her calls, but also record them. That's how he got the audio clip he later used in the voicemail to her mom. This revelation suggested that the murder may have been premeditated, directly contradicting what Alan had told the undercover officers during his confession. Still, proving that Alan had planned the murder in advance was nearly impossible. In the end, prosecutors agreed to reduce the charge to second-degree murder, which carried a lighter sentence. Alan's lawyer also advised him to take the deal and plead guilty, best way to avoid facing a first-degree murder charge. But even then, Alan insisted he acted in self-defense. He claimed he had been a victim of domestic abuse for years, saying that Lisa had physically assaulted him on multiple occasions. Prosecutors, on the other hand, argued that Alan had planned the murder in advance and then spent years trying to cover it up. In the end, the judge ruled there wasn't enough evidence to convict Alan of second-degree murder. Instead, he was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to just 7 years in prison. Prosecutors immediately filed an appeal, and the court sided with them. Alan's sentence was reviewed and extended, but only by 3 more years, bringing his total to 10. Lisa's family and friends were outraged, not just by the light sentence, but even more so when Alan was granted early release after serving just 5 years. However, he quickly violated the terms of his parole and was sent back to prison, where he remained until 2022, when he was officially released. So, while the punishment may have seemed shockingly lenient, the case still marked a rare and remarkable win for law enforcement. For an entire year, a team of undercover officers became part of Alan's everyday life, earning his trust and slowly guiding him into a carefully planned trap, where he finally gave up the dark secret he'd been hiding for years. It's also worth mentioning that after Alan's arrest, Lisa's children were placed in the care of her mother, and they've been living with her ever since. The case of a girl who went to her Sunday school and disappeared without a trace. The police and hundreds of volunteers searched everywhere but couldn't find the girl. This mystery remained unsolved for a whopping 48 years until an unexpected twist helped reveal the shocking truth. Gretchen Harrington was born on June 13, 1967 in Pennsylvania. She was the youngest of 3 daughters. Soon after her birth, the family moved to the small town of Brummel. Her father, who was a pastor, got a job at the local church. Gretchen immediately loved this town. She spent a lot of time outdoors with her sisters and new friends. Brummel was a safe place, so parents weren't afraid to let their children play outside until dark. With its rich nature and close-knit community, this place was more like a paradise for kids. Raised in a religious family, Gretchen spent a lot of time at her father's church. She also excelled in Sunday school, always getting top grades. On the morning of August 15, 1975, when Gretchen was 8 years old, her family eagerly awaited the arrival of her mother and newborn sister from the hospital. Gretchen also wanted to wait for them, but her father encouraged her not to miss Sunday school to keep her perfect grades. Reluctantly, she agreed, took her Bible and headed to church. Usually, she walked there with her older sisters, but they both stayed home that morning. Gretchen wasn't afraid to walk alone, as the church was less than a mile away, just an 8-minute walk from her house. The Sunday school lessons consisted of 2 parts. First, the children gathered at Trinity Church, and after about an hour and a half, some of them headed to Gretchen's father church. But at 11:30 a.m., when the kids arrived at the second church, Gretchen's father noticed that his daughter was not among them. It seemed strange because the children were brought as a group. He thought Gretchen might have stayed at the other church, so he called there. Answering the call was the wife of the pastor named David, who taught at the Sunday school. She said Gretchen wasn't there and told her husband about what was happening. He was surprised because Gretchen hadn't even attended his classes that morning. Her father immediately started to worry. He asked David to call the police and went searching for his daughter. The father drove along the route between the churches, checked other streets nearby, but Gretchen was nowhere to be found. He also reached out to her friend's parents, hoping she might have decided to spend time with some of them, but they were all either at church or home. Gretchen's best friend, David's daughter, also hadn't seen her all day. The police immediately began searching. As news of Gretchen's disappearance spread through the town, hundreds of volunteers quickly joined in. Practically all the locals knew Gretchen's father as they regularly attended his church, so they all wanted to help. Together with the volunteers, the police searched the entire town, then started combing through multiple wooded areas and the riverbank. A police helicopter was also sent to assist scanning the area from above. The search continued into the night, but yielded no results. The next day, even more volunteers joined in. The police created flyers with Gretchen's photo and information about her disappearance, which were posted along roads and handed out to passing drivers. Despite all efforts, not only did the police fail to find Gretchen, but they couldn't even determine what happened to her. After several days of searching, they didn't find any significant leads at all, and Gretchen's fate remained unknown. Her disappearance became a heavy blow to the local community. People were used to letting their children roam the streets freely from a young age, and nothing like this had ever happened before. The kids could spend hours wandering in the woods, swimming in the river without adult supervision, and their parents never worried. But now all of that was in the past. The fact that no one knew what happened to Gretchen only added to their fear. People discussed various theories. Some thought she might have run away from home. Others believed she went swimming in the river and drowned. But the most frightening theory was that someone had abducted her. Parents stopped letting their children out unsupervised. One local woman even cut her daughter's long hair so she would resemble a boy. Once a safe and peaceful town, overnight it became a place where people lived in uncertainty and fear. The police also questioned anyone who might have had any connection to Gretchen's disappearance. During these conversations, they received several intriguing leads. One witness reported seeing a girl resembling Gretchen near the church that morning. A green station wagon approached her, but the witness didn't see what happened next. Another person shared a similar story, but this time they said a white Cadillac approached the girl. The police followed up on these leads, checked the owners of all vehicles matching the descriptions in the area, but couldn't establish their involvement. For days after Gretchen's disappearance, detectives got a new lead. A resident of Westchester, located 30 minutes away from Brummel, called the police and said that he had found children's shorts matching the description of Gretchen's clothing. Investigators immediately showed them to Gretchen's mother, but she said they didn't belong to her daughter. From then on, there was no progress in the case for several weeks. The police called off the search operation and focused on the investigation. They continued interviewing people, following up on any available leads. But with each passing day, their hope of finding Gretchen alive diminished. This continued for 2 months until October 14th, when a chilling call came in to the police. A man went for a jog in a large national park, about a 20-minute drive from Brummel. There, he noticed something strange in the bushes. At first, he didn't realize what it was, but when he came closer, he suddenly realized it was a human body. He immediately ran to the park rangers to inform them of the discovery, and they called the police. Officers quickly realized the remains were those of a child, but due to the extent of decomposition, identifying the child was extremely challenging. Detectives assumed it might be Gretchen, so they showed her parents photos of the clothing, which had been left carefully folded next to the remains. Gretchen's mother immediately confirmed they belonged to her daughter because she had made those clothes herself. Soon, forensic experts confirmed it was indeed Gretchen by matching the remains with her dental records. They also determined that the cause of death was multiple severe blows to the head, and the case was reclassified as a homicide. Due to the level of decomposition, they couldn't determine any other details, including whether the victim had been sexually assaulted. Moreover, DNA analysis didn't exist in 1975, so investigators were once again left without any clues. News of the murder reignited the attention of the local community, and the police began receiving even more tips. People realized that a dangerous criminal could still be somewhere among them, so everyone wanted to see the perpetrator brought to justice as soon as possible. Investigators received dozens of tips about suspicious men spotted in the park area where Gretchen's body was found, but all these tips led to dead ends. They also checked everyone living within a few-mile radius who had a history of violent crimes, but this yielded no results either. Several months after the discovery of the body, the case completely stalled and there were no developments since then. Over the following years, the investigation was reopened from time to time. Detectives reviewed all available tips and leads, but each time it ended nowhere. The main problem was that detectives had no evidence at all. Even when the police began using DNA analysis, it didn't help in this particular case because no foreign samples were found on Gretchen's remains or her clothing. As a result, the case remained unsolved for many decades. It was occasionally mentioned in newspapers and featured on TV, but only in recent years did Gretchen's murder once again reignite wide public attention. Two journalists, Joanna and Mike, decided to write a book about the crime. They worked on it for several years, gathering all available information piece by piece and trying to uncover new facts. Both journalists grew up in Brummel and were roughly the same age as Gretchen at the time of her murder. Who was only 9 at the time, remembered it pretty well because it not only impacted her life, but also the entire town. After Gretchen's disappearance, children could no longer roam the streets or leave home unsupervised. They all feared that the perpetrator might strike again, and this fear haunted them for many years. Even young children couldn't help but feel how their lives had suddenly changed, so they all remembered Gretchen's murder throughout the years. To write the book, Joanna and Mike secured access to the case documents and spoke with many individuals involved in the case. They carefully pieced together the events of those days, detailing the entire story. This book was released in 2022 and immediately attracted significant attention to the case. However, its major impact came months later when a woman contacted the police to discuss Gretchen's case. She met with the leading detective to tell her story. The woman said that she was 10 years old at the time of the murder and lived in Havertone, just a short distance from Gretchen's home. She was friends with Gretchen and her older sisters, as well as numerous other kids in the area. She often slept over at her friends' houses. And one night, something horrifying happened. While she was staying at the house of 2 sisters, she woke up in the middle of the night to someone touching her. When she opened her eyes, she saw their father in front of her, who quickly left the room. She was afraid to tell anyone about it and stayed in this house for another night. The same thing happened again. Her friend's father entered the bedroom and started touching her. The following morning, she finally told one of the sisters what had happened. To her surprise, she answered that it happened quite frequently. The girl also said that her father sometimes came to her sister at night. When she returned home, she told her parents everything. However, instead of going to the police, they simply prohibited her from visiting her friend's house anymore. And all of this happened just a week before Gretchen's disappearance. After telling her story, the woman finally disclosed the name of this man. It was David Zanstra, the same pastor who taught at the Sunday school. But that wasn't the end of her story. She also revealed that a month after Gretchen's disappearance, one of her friends was twice approached by a man who attempted to abduct her. The girl refused to get into his car and later told her friends that it was Zanstra who tried to lure her somewhere. To corroborate her statement, the woman showed detectives her personal diary from that time. On September 15, 1975, she wrote about her friend's plea to keep it a secret, fearing that David Zanstra might harm her. After receiving this information, the police immediately reopened the investigation. Upon reviewing the case materials, detectives uncovered several suspicious facts that indirectly implicated David. As we remember, it was he who reported Gretchen's disappearance to the police. The pastor provided investigators with a detailed description of her clothing: dark blue zip-up shorts with front studs and pockets without zippers or buttons. He also mentioned that she wore a white top with her hair in braids. At the same time, he claimed not to have seen Gretchen that day. This raised a reasonable question. How could he know what clothes she wore that morning? Especially since, after her body was found, David's descriptions were confirmed. She was wearing those exact clothes. The detectives also learned that the Sunday school classes started about 50 minutes late because Zanstra didn't show up at the church at the usual time. It meant that he would have had enough time to abduct Gretchen, murder her, dispose of her body in the park, and return to the church to begin his lessons. According to David's testimony, which he provided right after Gretchen's disappearance, he drove some of the children in his van to her father's church after the Sunday school classes. He insisted he didn't see Gretchen that morning and only noticed her absence when her father brought it to his attention. Another intriguing fact was that David, along with his wife and 3 children, moved to another state just a few months after the disappearance. The pastor also owned several vehicles, one of which was a green station wagon. As we recall, a witness told the police they saw a similar vehicle approaching a girl near the church on the day Gretchen disappeared. Piecing together all this information, the detectives decided to speak with the man. At that time, he was 83 years old and lived in Georgia, so they drove there. On July 17, 2023, they met with him at the police station and began questioning him. When Zanstra realized the detectives suspected him of murder, he began to deny everything, asking them what exactly they got against him. They told him they had the testimony of a woman he had touched during a sleepover at his house, as well as a story about him molesting his own daughters. Upon hearing this, David was stunned, and pretty soon his demeanor changed completely. Understanding that his dirty secrets were exposed, he stopped denying, and 48 years after the murder, he began to speak. According to his account, that morning he drove to Gretchen's father's church in his green American motor station wagon and saw the girl leaving her house. Waiting until there were no witnesses around, he approached her and offered her a ride. Without any hesitation, Gretchen got into his car. She knew David well because their families were friends, and she was also on her way to his Sunday school classes. But instead of taking her to the church, he drove her to a deserted park area, stopped the car, and told her to undress. Gretchen refused and said she wanted to go home. So Zanstra struck her several times on the head, causing her to lose consciousness. The pastor removed her clothes, satisfied himself, and then drove her to another park. Unable to find a pulse on her, he carried her body into the bushes and covered it with branches. After that, David drove back to the church to start his classes. Upon hearing his confession, the police arrested Zanstra for Gretchen's murder and extradited him to Pennsylvania. He was placed in jail awaiting trial, but for the police, this was just the beginning of a much deeper investigation. Considering that Zanstra had assaulted at least several girls, detectives strongly believed that there were likely other victims. The situation was worsened by the fact that the man worked as a pastor in many different cities and states for decades, so he could have committed numerous other crimes. Most of the time, he worked with children, and he was deeply respected in society, which could have allowed him to avoid any suspicions. But now, when the truth finally came out, detectives took his DNA sample and began searching for matches in other unsolved cases. They also looked into unsolved disappearances of girls in the cities where David had been working. Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the first possible connection. Investigators quickly came across the disappearance of 4-year-old Amanda Campbell from California, which occurred in 1991. Like Gretchen, she walked out of her home in a quiet neighborhood and vanished without a trace. At the time, David Zanstra worked as a pastor in that same neighborhood. Right now, there is no evidence against him, but the police say this case has several striking similarities to Gretchen's abduction, and the pastor could be the same perpetrator. They are also continuing to investigate his possible involvement in other crimes. Considering that all of this is happening right now, we may learn a lot more in the coming months. As for the trial for the murder of Gretchen, it has not yet begun. It is possible that David's lawyers will want to prolong the process and advise him to retract his confession. In that case, the trial could drag on for years, and there are no guarantees that the man will live to see the verdict. Alright guys, share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.